All right, next up we've got Luke Kantola. Hey, Luke.
Hey Chris, how's it going?
Good. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a motion designer in the outdoor film industry. I originally got started doing human-powered adventure stories. That got tied into conservation ecology, and that's led to the outdoor film industry.
Right on. So what's your Mardini entry that you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so my Mardini entry is for the Valley Day, and it's a mapping entry that deals with your perception of the size of landscapes. So we're going to take a satellite image and then move a camera out and blend into a historical map of Glen Canyon.
Very cool. Well, let's jump in.
Okay.
All right, here we are. So we're going to be talking about reviving archival maps with the Heightfield tools inside of Houdini. And it's going to be an overview of my Mardini entry for Valley. So on the left here, we have an archival map of the Glen Canyon area, Lake Powell, the Colorado River. In the center, we have a height map of that area. And then on the right, we have a satellite image. And we're going to be taking all three of these and combining them into a compelling environment. So let's go ahead and watch my Mardini entry for Valley and see what I did with these three maps. So that's the entry. It's rendered in Redshift. We can see if we start at the first frame, there's the satellite image is really clearly coming through. The terrain is being extruded based on the height map that I showed. And then as the scene plays right here, we fade into that archival map that matches up with the terrain. And obviously there's the balloon with Glen Canyon written on it, and then there's just like a simple vellum sim to drop that rope down. Yeah, let's go ahead and dive into the process. So we need to source our maps, and sourcing height maps, there's a lot of ways to do it. There's some free tools. There's the Labs Mapbox tools inside of Houdini. They're free. They're really awesome. It just requires that you sign up for an API. And the one gotcha with the Mapbox tools is that they'll bring in terrains that are just really large scale. So it can be hard to work with the erosion tools with them just like that. So sometimes you'll have to scale them down. So it's something to watch out for with the Mapbox tools. Another free tool is the Tangrams Height Mapper, and it allows you to download relatively small tiles of height maps. But it's free. It's an online interface. You could probably figure out how to source and stitch them together using Python or something if you wanted to. As far as paid tools go, there's GeoLayers for After Effects, which is a really nice interface and a great way to download like multiple types of maps at once. I think the only tool that I've found that beats GeoLayers is Offline Map Maker. It's a Windows only tool. It's a paid tool, but it can download any zoom level of a map. And then you just enter in the four corners of like the latitude and longitude points, and it will download that zoom level of whatever map source you want and then stitch it together for you. So here we're talking about height maps, but these tools, besides the Tangrams tool, all of these tools will also source satellite images. And that's really important because we want a matching satellite image for our height map to start this effect off. So we'll move on and talk about sourcing our archival maps. Two of my favorite sources for archival maps are the University of Texas Map Archive and then oldmapsonline.org. Oldmapsonline.org is awesome because it uses a map interface to find your maps. So you can go to certain areas and it will show you what archival maps exist for that area. But there's lots of places to find archival maps. These are just a couple that I really like, and they'll definitely get you started. Like there's enough here to really dig into something. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do we combine these layers to create a compelling environment. I think the one thing that you have to watch out for and that we're about to go over is how do you match up the archival map with the satellite and height map imagery. The satellite and height map imagery typically will line up really well, but the archival maps aren't necessarily made from satellite imagery. I mean, a lot of them are made from airplanes or ground navigation. And usually what I do to make them match is some kind of mesh warp operation using a puppet tool, either in Photoshop or After Effects. And I usually actually morph the satellite imagery and not the archival imagery because we don't want to distort the text elements that exist on the archival map. So I'll just quickly show you what that looked like for me in After Effects. Okay, so to prepare these textures, I'm in After Effects, but you could be in Photoshop or anything really where you can do a mesh distortion of an image. So we have our satellite image here, and we want to bring in our archival map and match it up as best as possible. So I've done that. Let's turn the opacity down and see if we can see how well it's lining up. So like I said before, we are going to distort the satellite image because we don't want to distort any of the text elements on the archival map. So I've already done that. And if I click on my satellite image and then turn my puppet tool on, we can see that the rivers lock in, and I'll just toggle that a couple times. And if we look at the puppet tool, we can see that I'm mainly focusing around major features like rivers. Here's a peak that I've focused on, and I'm just pulling these points in so that they line up. If I pull one out, you can see obviously it's no longer aligned, and I can pull it in. So this isn't a tutorial on how to use the puppet tool. It's just something that you're going to need to do if you want to have an archival map match a height map. And then you can just copy and paste your puppet tool onto your height map or any other map layers that you have, and then export them all, crop and export them all. Okay, here we are in Houdini. We're going to go through this project pretty quickly here. We've got a camera rig, some lights, and then our geometry. We have our balloon and the rope that drops down, and the table, which is this UV grid we're seeing. It's just the background pretty much. And then the map, which is our main attraction. So we'll dive into the map and start up here. So we have our Heightfield file that we're loading in. I've also loaded it into a quick shade so we can look at it here. There it is. When we load it in, it comes in at almost 10 million voxels, as you can see right here. So that's way too much resolution for what we want to do. So one way, you can resample it down to a smaller voxel size, or you can just take a stock height field and plug it in, and that will choke the Heightfield file down to 250,000 voxels. So that's just the trick that I use sometimes if I want to limit my starting resolution when working with a Heightfield. So the first thing we do is we'll look at this Heightfield file, and you can see it's just really low elevation here. So I'm going to remap it and make it look like pointy garbage. But that's okay because we'll blur it here. And this is the first time where we feel like we're getting a representation of our height field clearly. There's our height field. Here's our first operation. And I'll just throw down a switch here. So as we go, we can see it as it evolves. So we have our quick shade and then our first Heightfield remap and blur, and then we're going to run an erosion, and this erosion is just 20 frames stock erosion, and it's frozen at frame 20. And then I always like to cache out my erosions so you can jump in at different parts of the process and not need to recook everything. So if we drop our erosion pass in, you can see that a lot of the rounded edges get knocked down, and it starts feeling like something a bit more like a terrain. Obviously, it's still pretty low resolution. You can see there's bumpiness to it, and We are going to upsample it here in a second, but first what we're going to do is use a height field layer to layer back in some of that original detail from the height field file. So the way the height field layer works is it takes your base terrain and then it layers on another terrain. And using this layer scale value, we can scale that original height field file. So here's that bumpy, peaky mess that we don't want. And here's no added terrain. And we just want something, I think 3.6 was a good value there. And then when we're going to resample it here, so we're just increasing, doubling our resolution. And with volumes, that means we're quadrupling the number of voxels that we have. So now we're at 1 million voxels, and we'll plug that into our switch. So we go from our quick shade to our first blur operation, our first erosion, and then layering back in that original height field and resampling up. So we're going to remap again. One thing about the remap, it's not just to create more relief in your terrains. It's not just about creating more elevation. A lot of it is about creating steeper slope angles. So if I put in a high maximum like 200, we get these really steep cliffs. And the erosion tools are going to work very differently on cliffs that are sloped like this than cliffs that are sloped like this. There's no cliffs. That's just like a little hill. So by remapping and increasing the relief on the terrain, we actually get some more interesting effects with our erosion tools. So I ran another stock erosion and froze it at frame 20, and we'll just look at that through the switch now. So from the beginning, we have our height field quick shade, and then we have our first height field blur here. Let's see, then we're doing an erosion pass. Then we're upsampling and bringing in our original height field detail. So here we are, that's looking pretty good. And now we're doing a remapping operation and another erosion. And this is where we start getting some pretty nice effects. I really like how this cliff drops off to this kind of debris slump on this side. But then when we look at the other side, we just have the slump happening. It's kind of more like a sheet of rock coming right up to the peak. So it feels like there are different processes happening on the terrain. And that's really nice. I like that effect. So we'll keep going here. We're going to upsample again. We had 1 million voxels. Now we're going up to 4 million by doubling the resolution. Now, because we have 4 million voxels, you'll remember the original height field had almost 10 million voxels, and we have a copy of it here. So this is the original height field again, but this time it's not being choked by that height field. So rather than having 250,000 voxels, we're bringing in the full 10 million voxels here. So we're going to get a lot of detail back, and we're going to do the height field layer operation again and bring back some of that detail. That's what that looks like. We can bring that into our switch. And from the beginning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you can see, we're just layering these erosion passes. We're stepping up our resolution as we go. We're layering back in the original height field data. And what we're coming out with is a terrain that looks pretty cool. You can see there's a lot more detail coming in. There's like creek and stream rivulets coming in. There's more detail on the slumping that's happening. There's a nice texture happening here. Yeah. So as we keep moving down, I just turn this thing into polygons now. There's two ways to work with height fields when you're rendering. You can either convert them into polygons or go through a COP network and export a height field as like a black and white image that you then bring in as a displacement map. And if you want to follow that workflow, and Tagma has a great tutorial about that, which I'll link in a later slide. But I went with a Polygon workflow because it's a little bit faster. It's a little bit easier to see what you're doing. And for Mardini, it was really important to always be able to iterate quickly on ideas. So I went with a Polygon workflow, and I'll just load my file cache so I don't have to bake anything. And we're looking at 2 million polygons with a poly reduce in here. And what does that look like? Oh, okay, so I transformed everything as well. So we can look at it like this. I just rotated it for the camera for some reason. So we definitely lose some of that detail that's in the height field with the poly reduce. But I think the reason that I wasn't too worried about this is because the camera isn't that close when we start, and the satellite image is filling in a lot of that detail as well. So I went ahead and made the project a little bit leaner, but you could, again, keep a lot of that detail around by either not doing the poly reduce operation or by doing a displacement map workflow, which is a little different. So then we're just UVing. Oh, I forgot to mention that I extruded the volume, the height field, so that we get sides because I wanted it to be like sitting on a table at the end. So UV projection for the top, changing the mesh of the sides, giving it normals, giving it UVs, and then giving each of them materials. And then the transition between the satellite image to the archival map is driven by an attribute create that's just keyframed between 1 and 0. So when Redshift sees this attribute called transition, if the number is 1, it's 100% blended to the satellite map. And if the number is 0, it blends 100% to the archival map or 0% of the satellite map. So that's how that's getting driven. And then we just hit the render null. That's really all there is to it. Okay, so just to review really quickly, we used the height field layer node to add original detail back into our erosion passes. And that's really the crux of this workflow. We upsampled our terrain in passes while also increasing the overall elevation change using a height field remap. And that just allowed our erosion tools to really dig into the terrain and create the kind of detail that we were looking for. The last thing is that if you're interested in using the COPS or displacement workflow that I mentioned earlier, rather than the heavier polygonal workflow, then you can check out live rendering of height fields in Redshift 3D from Intagma, and it's just a great tutorial. The last thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up is just how this camera rig is working. It's pretty simple. There's 5 parameters that are getting animated. There's an object that is on a curve. It's the sphere. And using constraint networks, chop networks, the camera is looking at this object as it animates along a curve. So this allows me to have pretty good control of like where the focus is happening in the scene at any given time. Then the camera itself is on its own curve. So you can see, and if I pull out here, you can see the camera curve. So this is the camera curve here. And if I turn the map off, we'll be able to see the curve that the sphere is on. So you can see my camera here. It's a little small, but you can see it tracking as it looks at the sphere. And it's really powerful because you can say you want the move to start here. No problem. Now the whole move starts from that position. And it's really easy to adjust the way that shots are coming together using this technique. And then I just have a framing position. So it's just like where the sphere is in the camera frame. So it allows you to create like compositional changes really easily and keyframe those as well. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and let me know if you want to see a tutorial about the camera rig or anything else that you've seen here. All right, have a good one. Cheers.